When I was putting together my kids' sermon, it reminded me of something that happened, my gosh, about 60 years ago. That was back in the days when in Glen Ellen, Memorial Day was the first day of the Little League season. And we had a Memorial Day parade, and all of us could wear our baseball uniforms and march through the town. This is way before traveling. The traveling team, we meant you walk across the street to play. It didn't go anywhere. It didn't start till the end of May, went into August. And so we had a parade, and then just toward the end of the parade, we took a right turn, and the parade ended up in the cemetery. And I was kind of confused, and I went, Dad, what? It's the beginning of Little League season. What are we doing in the middle of a cemetery? And my dad looks at me and he says, would you look at the names on all these tombstones? And I did, and he said, well, if it wasn't for those men and women, you wouldn't be playing Little League today. That's what today is all about. So we took a little time and had a prayer and sang the national anthem, and then we went on to have the opening of the Little League season. I realized today is about honoring the fallen. It's amazing, isn't it, that men and women died so that we could live, that they died so that our nieces and nephews and kids and grandkids could graduate and go to trade school and go to college and become pipe fitters and plumbers and cops and lawyers and chefs and nurses and teachers and all that kind of stuff. That they died so that somehow our dreams might be able to come true. So there's a lot to think about today and a lot to think about tomorrow. I can't imagine what it would be like to have two military personnel come to your front door and knock on the door and tell you that your loved one had died in service to your country. I remember talking to Peggy's late husband about that when he got notified that his son Vincent was killed in Iraq. It just sends chills through my body to think about it, and it wasn't even me. And that's why I think those of you in the military, days like Veterans Day and Memorial Day are so precious, because you realize when you signed up to serve your country, that could have been you, because you didn't know what the situation and the future was going to bring. How can we repay them for their sacrifice? How can we repay you, those of you who have signed up to give us that gift of freedom? Well, the fact is we can't. There's no way we can do it. But we can say thank you to people like Tom and the Veterans Commission for their commitment to the men and women in uniform and those who are serving overseas. We can go shopping and buy a few supplies and put them on the table. Whenever we see someone who is wearing the uniform and selling poppies or doing that, we can cross the street and say thank you for your service. But the most important thing we can do is to give back what we can to make the world a little better. Because sacrifice is not about what we give up. Sacrifice is what we give back. And when we give back, we do just a little something to honor the memory and the spirit of those who have gone before. Tomorrow's Memorial Day, and I always have the honor of going downtown with my cousin John, and he does a memorial service in Grant Park. John is a lifelong Air Force veteran. He's a 5-star general, and if you didn't know that, he'd be glad to tell you. He's dedicated his entire life to the Air Force. He spent 6.5 years in a POW camp, and he's the first one to admit that Memorial Day is not about him and anybody else. It's about the fallen, those who gave their life in defense of their country. Last year, he spoke on Veterans Day in Orland Park, and afterwards, people asked him questions, and they said, John, honestly, how did you survive 6.5 years in a prison camp, away from those you love, being tortured? And he said, you know something? He said, every day I would wake up, whatever was happening to me, and I would just march on. The next day I'd get up and I'd march on. 2 years went by and I'd march on. 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 6. I marched on because I knew I'd either die here or I'd go back. But no matter what, I had to keep on marching. And now, of course, we honor those who are marching in a kingdom that will never end, a kingdom called heaven. How can we honor them? Well, you know, we got to keep on marching too. You know that. If you have a loved one who lives with Alzheimer's and you need to take care of that person, you got to march on every single day. You can't give up. If you're battling an addiction, one day at a time, every day you get up, you got to march on. If you strike out 4 times in a Little League game and you feel like you're the one that lost the game, you got to get up the next day and you got to march on. Even if you're 12 years old, you got to do it. You may be tired and your plate is full. What can you do? You got to march on. That's what we're called to do every day. I just got back late last night from my grandson's graduation in Flagstaff, Arizona. Flagstaff has to be one of the most diverse, crazy cities and towns I've ever seen. I mean, every single food group that God made lives in Flagstaff. And so we had the graduation. It was in the University of Arizona State's big dome. It's huge. And so we gathered at the dome. And as I watched people come in and I watched the crowd, my gosh, every color of the rainbow was in that building. All shapes and sizes. Flannel shirts and tattered jeans and tattoos and fancy shirts and suits and all that kind of stuff. There were 5 different languages in the ceremony. There was applause, there was hugs, there was all kinds of flags and patriotism. You know, when you graduate here in Orland Park, they tell you, don't applaud until the end, let's get this thing done. Well, there, they just said, do whatever you want. If you're a niece and nephew, kids up there, you just do it. You shout, applaud. So the thing lasted for 3.5 hours. But everybody got their due. Afterwards, we took pictures, and it finally got quiet, and my son and I were walking down to the car, and I looked back at that big dome, and I thought to myself, isn't that the way the world should be? All of us together, applauding, hugging, respecting each other, honoring those kids who probably take that gift of freedom for granted and you don't know what the future is going to bring. But I thought to myself, that's what our veterans fought for. That's what many of them died for. It's what we live for today. They gave it all. Many of you know what it's like to give it all. And so can we, one day at a time, with courage and strength and a higher power that lives in the guts of each one of us. Amen. If you're able to, please rise for the creed.